Today on the show, we have Mark Young, CEO of Zona Health. So before we jump in, I just want to define a couple things. So Mark, if you could define isometric exercise.
Yeah. So pleasure to meet you, Michael. Good being on the podcast. I appreciate the invite. What is isometric exercise? Well, isometric, I'll give you a definition and say most people are familiar with concentric and eccentric movement. So I'll make the comparison there. So think of concentric movement as being the up of a sit-up, and eccentric being the extension of the muscle, which is the down of the sit-up. So you're contracting and you're expanding. You're contracting and then you're expanding. Isometric is literally means equal measurement, meaning that it's not an expansion or a contraction, but rather an exact static placeholder. So it's not placeholder, but a static hold. So consider, like, instead of a sit-up, it would be the equivalent of a plank. A plank is an isometric, or a wall sit, or a squat hold. All of those things would be considered isometric.
Great. And so what would you say is an benefit of doing isometric as opposed to eccentric?
So isometric is just different. Isometric is a holding a muscle group in the exact same place as opposed to doing like I said, an up and down of a sit-up. It's a different way of working a muscle, and what would I say is different? It's a completely different physiological reaction that your body has. So it's like, tell me the ways an airplane is different from a car. Both transportation and yet entirely different, to just toss out a quick list of changes of differences.
All right, fair enough. And then next up, define hypertension.
So hypertension, by definition, is actually a person whose blood pressure is elevated beyond what's considered normal or safe measurements. So the American Heart Association, up until 2022, I believe it was, that they made the change, blood pressure in our country was 120/80. That was considered the healthy standard. Back in 2012, I believe it was, the American Heart Association decided to change that and say that healthy blood pressure is now a 110 systolic with a 72 diastolic, being the measurement, which really just means, and systolic is the top number, if people are not familiar with that. So systolic is the top number, diastolic is the bottom number. Systolic blood pressure is actually the measurement in the arteries when the heart beats. That's how much pressure is being exerted from your heart and what is the impact that has on the arterial walls during a heartbeat. Pardon me. Diastolic is actually measuring the space between that. So it is the pressure in the arteries between heartbeats. And that actually reflects what is the pressure that's moving through the body when the heart is resting and not beating. So you've got the beats, and then between the beats, between systolic and diastolic. Systolic is normally the one that most people pay more attention to because it is the one that has the greatest amount of variability.
That's the higher number, right?
The top number.
Yeah.
And systolic blood pressure is much more flexible. It's much more variable. But the reality is that hypertension itself is a problem for 45% of the adult population in the US. People have elevated blood pressure, and that can take its place in multiple different ways. Part of it can be, diet and exercise related. Part of it is, stress. We live in a not just emotional stress, but also just oxidative stress on the body. And then I'll go one step beyond that and say that we also just age. That as we age, there is actually a system in the body that actually, ages with us, and that is our circulatory system. And that system, you've heard the word arteriosclerosis. Over time, the blood vessels actually begin to harden because they just don't get fed what they need to be fed, and then it's almost like a dried sponge.
Mm-hmm.
So
I've heard you give an analogy about a hose.
Yeah. So even like a garden hose, pressure. When we talk about pressure or blood pressure specifically, think of a garden hose that ends up with a kink. You put a kink in the garden hose, then all of a sudden, and then you let it go, and the pressure that's built up, bursts water out the other side. And that's really the intention when we're measuring blood pressure. You're measuring how much pressure does it take to move something through a blood vessel.
Hmm.
Now, the less flexible those blood vessels are, it literally is a matter of if it's a dried up sponge that's trying to move moisture, it doesn't move real well because it's not flexible. There is no what we call vasodilation taking place, which is when pressure is greater, you want to open the blood vessel wider, and the wider the blood vessel opens, the lower the pressure, right? I mean, if you're trying to move the same amount of fluid um, through a narrow passage, you widen the passage and the pressure goes down. That's just common sense, right?
Take control of your own health. I am so cold. It literally feels like electricity is running through my body. I feel superhuman. You said that the American Heart Association lowered the normal range from 120 to 110.
Mhm.
Why did they do that?
Oh, my friend, I wish I had the answer to that. I try
I would
not to.
imagine that puts more people in the
It
danger zone.
absolutely puts more people in the danger zone. If you lower the threshold, if I say, tall people are all over 5'6", and then I'm like, wait, I actually mean 5'4", suddenly there's more tall people in the world because I just changed the definition, right? But nobody's height actually changed. The American Heart Association's justification was that, they realized that 120/80, they decided is now pre-hypertensive. And that just means that that person may, be in the danger or maybe, on the rise. I try not to be cynical with it because I think, well, if more people are diagnosed, and standard of care is that the more you diagnose somebody, the more that you end up having to, standard of care is that we need to prescribe antihypertensives. So I'm like, well, if you just change the definition and more people got diagnosed, that literally means more people also got prescribed. Um, I don't know. I don't like thinking that that's the way the world works. But I'm also not naive.
Seems like a good way to push product, if you know what I mean. So you believe that you have a way of lowering hypertension.
Well, so we actually focus on isometric exercise. So I actually run a company called Zona Health, which it can be found at zona.com, Zona.com, if anybody wants to look that up. And Zona is actually an exercise device that has provided a biofeedback way of actually doing precise isometric exercise using hand grip strength. What's interesting about it is that isometrics has actually been linked to a blood pressure reduction through studies for decades. The likes of Johns Hopkins University, the Harvard Health Letter, the Mayo Clinic, they've all studied isometric, and they understand that isometrics actually lead to a systemic and sustained reduction in blood pressure over time. What Zona attempts to do and successfully does is actually we hack into the isometric biofeedback and provide the stimulus that everybody else has studied. So they've studied isometrics and said, wow, isometrics is super effective when trying to lower blood pressure. And we're like, great, well, we have a device that actually does isometrics. And because we're able to provide exact isometrics, people end up getting the results they're looking for at a very high rate. We're actually right now in the process of we're doing FDA clinical trials right now where we are studying things under the FDA's supervision to be able to make the claims that we do what we say we do, which is super exciting.
And just to describe your product, it's basically like you squeeze a device.
Yeah, it actually, so the story behind it, the science itself of isometrics was actually discovered in the US Air Force. There was a study that was being done by a doctor named Ron Wiley, and he actually was doing a study to figure out how do they stop pilots from experiencing what's called G-force blackout when they move into Mach speeds. So when pilots are flying at Mach speeds, if you saw the latest Top Gun movie, you'll remember that, when they pulled out and went into higher speeds to get out of the trench, they would pass out for a couple moments. And Tom Cruise is telling them, that's when you're at your most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one guy passed out and couldn't come back. And that's called G-force blackout. It's literally just your blood pressure goes so low during that time that you just pass out. So he was studying that, but funny enough, very serendipitously, during the research, he discovered that people's blood pressure, all the pilots that they were studying, their blood pressure was going down over time. And again, these are guys that are in the military, right? They're US Air Force. They're already in good shape,
Mhm.
but their blood pressure was going down. And he's like, well, that's a really interesting thing. So after they did the G-force study, they ended up, he took that data and ended up doing a study for the next, 10, 20 years. And in doing so, discovered that the connection was actually in the way that they were gripping the joystick that flies the jet.
Wow.
So when they're in the aircraft and they start moving at crazy speeds, they're obviously squeezing that joystick, the joystick being the handle that's used to steer and pilot the plane. It really is called a joystick, by the way. I know that makes me sound like a weird gamer, but that's really what it's called. So they actually, the tighter they grip it and for the longer duration of time, it actually is an isometric exercise. And that was never the intention, but that's kind of what happened. Like I said, it was a bit of an accidental discovery. So what he started doing with his research is really crafting and saying, wow, at what grip strength and for how long would you get the optimal results? So he started working through that and, like I said, over the course of over a decade, researched that and found out an optimal squeeze, found an optimal duration of time, how often does it need to be done, and really just perfected that algorithm. And that's the same algorithm that we use today in Zona.
Hmm. So if those pilots weren't gripping the joystick, their heart rate wouldn't have decreased?
Nope, two unrelated things. So
Gotcha.
when they were doing the research, what they were trying to do is study G-force blackout. So they did that research, but Dr. Wiley, when they were doing that study, they actually had determined from the beginning of the study, they'd obviously taken everybody's, health history and took all their stats. When the study ended, they of course did it again. And he's like, every single pilot's blood pressure had lowered over the course of the 8 weeks or whatever it was that they conducted that study. It's like everybody's blood pressure went down from the start of the study to the end. So not related to what was going on necessarily in the plane. And he's like, but what was the connection that every pilot's blood pressure regulated? Like that
Mhm.
makes no sense to me. So they did the G-force study and tried to find ways that they could do that. But then he took all that information and said, all right, we have X number of pilots. Every single one of their blood pressure went down over time. What could that be related to? And that's when he made the connection to the isometric hold that they were gripping onto that joystick in the aircraft.
Right. And so you've basically taken that and put it into a product.
Correct.
Now,
Correct.
should everybody always, like, if you have so let's say you have a perfect, according to the AHA metric of like 110 over 70, like, should you still be trying to get that number lower?
I missed the numbers that you just said. What were the
Well,
numbers?
let's say you're 110 over 70, like
Yeah,
in
you don't
normal
want
range.
that lower. That's healthy.
So
Uh,
basically, so if you're like like totally healthy, you shouldn't be trying to lower it.
the idea is not to always be lowering blood pressure. The idea is to be optimizing blood pressure.
Got it.
So you want to keep in the optimized range, which is about 110 over 72, which is where you want to be. Some people have lower blood pressure, some people have higher blood pressure, and a lot of it's based on environment and behavior. But 110 over 72 is where you want to be. We're not lowering blood pressure. We we're creating an environment where the cardiovascular system goes back to normal. So we're not lowering blood pressure per se, because we're not doing anything to blood pressure. What we're doing is we're actually helping the cardiovascular system with its flexibility. So increasing flexibility of the cardiovascular system ends up turning into lower blood pressure, because a better cardiovascular system does that. So you're not trying to get your blood pressure to zero, because then you would be dead. The idea is that you want your blood pressure to stay at 110 over 72 approximately. And the idea is that in order for it to do that, you need to make sure that your cardiovascular system is in good shape.
Gotcha.
So we're
Um,
working out from the inside out.
cool. So most people who use your product are probably older, you'd say?
Um, I would say that people who tend to have higher blood pressure tend to be older.
Hmm.
But I would say that that's the equivalent of, you normally change tires on cars with more miles, and that is you don't need to change the tires when the miles are low. So what happens to us as we age is things age along with us, right? So people who are older are using the device not necessarily because, older people are more attracted to the science, but because they're the ones with the problem, right? People at 19 years old don't use hair dye either because they just haven't aged that way yet. So,
Yeah.
yes, the higher blood pressure, but higher blood pressure is a result of cardiovascular stiffness, um, is also an age-related thing. And usually it's because we've banged up our bodies quite a bit, right? We haven't fed it correctly. We haven't worked it out correctly. A lot of people live sedentary lives or they eat less than ideal diets. And those things all cause lift in hypertension.
Yeah. So like what percentage of people over like the age of let's say 60 experience hypertension?
Um, a tough question. I will say 45% of the entire US population experiences hypertension. I will tell you that for women, the number over 40 years old is 60%.
Wow.
So it is a huge problem. What's interesting, speaking of women with hypertension, is the 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 biggest issue that women face is the prior to menopause, men are more likely, 3 to 1, more likely to have a cardiovascular event than a woman. Post menopause, women are actually more likely to have a cardiovascular event.
Really?
Yes. And part of that is simply because estrogen is a vasodilator. So as production is depleted in the body doesn't function the way it used to. And part of one of those things is that blood flow doesn't work the way it used to, simply because um, that vasodilation doesn't take place. And vasodilation can also be a response of nitric oxide production, which also decreases in both men and women over 40. Uh, we actually start losing the enzymes in the gut that are able to convert, products like L-citrulline into nitric oxide and whatnot. So the body ends up going a little bit, I don't want to say south, but things happen. As you age, there's a different care that you take of your body. And this is a way that you can increase cardiovascular fitness as you age, particularly for people who are somewhat sedentary. Like if they're not people who go to the gym, or they're not people who walk or run or live an active lifestyle. And people who don't live active lifestyles tend to be older, and then it's kind of the chicken or the egg, right? Are they old because they don't move around or have an active lifestyle, or do they not have an active lifestyle because they've gotten old? And there's connections in both directions there. Like there are old people who are out running and there are young people who sit on the couch. But the older somebody gets, the more slower and sedentary they become typically. So yes, older people tend to use our device more.
And would you say that your device is meant to be used instead of medication or with medication?
I would never actually tell anybody to stop taking medication. What I would tell you is that your doctor has prescribed your medication, but we are an exercise device. And if you start any kind of exercise routine, you should let your doctor know, because they're going to have to check your levels. No different than if you got put on blood pressure medication and decided that you were going to start running.
Mhm.
You go buy a treadmill and you start running every day. You need to check your blood pressure more regularly, because if your blood pressure naturally starts lowering on its own because of healthy lifestyle choices, you may end up in a situation where you are over medicated.
Mhm.
And you never want to be in a situation when you're over medicated, because statins and other types of antihypertensives, I'll say they artificially lower blood pressure, but they're introduced in the body to lower the blood pressure, not fix the systemic issue. That's why you have to always take them. They're lowering it somewhat artificially. It's not a systemic fix. So when you end up, changing your inputs, whether that be running, jogging, any kind of lifestyle change in diet, all of that stuff leads to a a better, healthier cardiovascular life. And you should always tell your doctor when you've made those types of changes to make sure that you are not over medicated. um,
Yeah.
against your baseline.
Yeah. So it's like medication is like putting a band-aid on the problem, whereas actually like increasing you having a healthy lifestyle is actually fixing the root of the cause.
Well, I mean, medication is not necessarily a Band-Aid because it actually is fixing the problem in the immediate. It would be kind of like putting a staple, but it doesn't fix the problem that the paper is torn, right? It's like you're
Hmm.
taping the paper back together, but it doesn't fix the fact that the paper's torn. If we're actually repairing the tear in the paper, the tape's no longer necessary. But as long as there's a tear, the tape is always going to be there, and that's the same thing. Like the the blood pressure medications, they are reducing blood pressure measurements. But it's lowering your blood pressure because it's either thinning your blood or it's triggering vasodilation, but it's not actually reconditioning your cardiovascular system, which is what you ultimately want, right? It's the difference between working out or, I'll give an example. The world right now seems to be obsessed with GLP-1s,
Hmm.
the Ozempic, crowd, the semaglutide and all the other things that are all GLP-1 agonists. The reality is all of those are great for weight loss because pretty much all you're doing is starving your body. But now your body's malnourished. And then the minute you come off the GLP-1, you end up putting weight back on because your body hasn't been eating all this time. Um, Nothing will replace just a good diet and exercise routine. So starving yourself, but then not going to the gym can give you the superficial response of you lost weight on the scale, but it didn't make you healthier per se.
Hmm.
So what we're recommending is that while an antihypertensive can certainly help the numbers, it doesn't it doesn't ultimately lead to fitness. It just lowers the numbers.
Right. But doing, your isometric exercises will improve the fitness.
Doing multiple different types of exercises would increase fitness, but yes, ours is definitely one that's specifically targeted towards cardiovascular health.
What kind of results have you seen? Like, I'm sure you have examples of people like getting off medication entirely, or.
I have a battery of testimonials of people who have said that they got exactly what they wanted from using the device. And again, some people find themselves just not as dependent as they once were. Some people don't need that intervention at all. But the reality is again, it's using it in such a way that we are under doctor supervision. Again, I'm always cautious to say, yes, people didn't take their medications anymore because then people are like, oh my gosh, and they throw their meds away, right? I never want that situation. I want people to realize that using Zona is an exercise intervention that you can literally squeeze in your hand while sitting on the couch. It doesn't require the stress or anything of a treadmill or anything like that. It's not a gym membership. It is literally a handheld device where you can do it from the couch. The testimonials we get are people are just shocked that it is so easy, but
Hmm.
at the same time, it's somewhat counterintuitive. That's the funny thing, because who would have thought that doing this would lead to that? So it's a counterintuitive intervention that I love because I love that kind of stuff. It's very disruptive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we get people on the regular who are telling us how amazing it is. They never would have thought it. The big thing with any kind of exercise or fitness routine is consistency.
Yeah.
It's doing it consistently so that you always um, are getting the result that you're looking for because you are. Like, you can't use a treadmill twice and complain you didn't lose weight.
Yeah. I would never would have thought that just squeezing something for, a couple minutes a day is going to make that big of an impact, but I guess it does.
Yeah, it's a little more than just squeeze something. There's a little bit more to it, and there's, like I said, there's an algorithm to the way it works and how much you squeeze it and for how long and so on, and it guides you through all of that while you're using it. But the reality is like it is incredible. I'll be honest
Yeah.
with you. Like it's incredible that this happens, and what I love about it, it is like the ultimate biohack, because you're not introducing anything else to your body. You're not putting in a supplement. You're not creating red light. You're not anything. You're literally just letting your body do what your body knows how to do. A friend of mine who's a functional medicine doctor always uses the phrase that functional medicine is just reminding the body of what it already knew. Your body knows how to maintain its own blood pressure. It just lost something along the way, and all we're doing is reminding it to do that on its own.
Right. How long does it usually take to see results?
Usually people start to notice at about 4 to 6 weeks. Some can take 6 to 8, depending how, the situation, how compliant they are with it. And everyone's physiology is different.
Cool.
But yeah.
So I know that you do cold plunge. I've seen on other podcasts that you have one. Have you done any experiments with measuring blood pressure with cold plunging?
I have not. Now, I will say that cold plunging in the triggering of cold reactive proteins actually can increase blood pressure, like any fitness does.
Like over a long period of time?
Not over a long time. Not over a long time. What cold plunging does, as well as sauna in many ways, so any kind of extreme hot or extreme cold, does something similar to what Zona does, in fact. So when you end up doing a cold plunge, you actually force your body into a sympathetic nervous system response. And what that means, that's your fight or flight, right? It's the reason why you get in the cold plunge and every cell in your body wants to get out. But the reality is that you go in there and you force yourself in there. And when you force yourself in there, you create I'm going to say psychological, but also physiological discipline of being able to downregulate your nervous system. In downregulating your nervous system from that sympathetic back to your parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest side of your nervous system, you actually increase vagal tone. Much the similar way that Zona functions when you're squeezing this for a period of time. It's uncomfortable. I'm not going to say it hurts, but it's uncomfortable. And when that happens, you actually are triggering that same sympathetic nervous system response that it's the same response that you are actually doing in a cold plunge. So the cold plunge is doing the same thing as far as the nervous system response, not the same as everything else, but the same as the same nervous system response is taking place. You're going from a parasympathetic, relaxed state, and then you're triggering this, like, emergency bell goes off in your body, like something's wrong, something's not working. And then once that stimulus is over, once you get out of the cold plunge, you go back to that parasympathetic relax. Like everything's okay. The body realizes that it doesn't, it's not in danger anymore. Everything's fine. Now, granted, cold plunge, like I said, it actually triggers, cold reactive protein production. It actually leads to, muscle recovery, and so on. We could go off on that topic, but from a nervous system response, Zona does function much the same way as a cold plunge would.
Cool. So yeah, so you are an advocate of it.
Of cold plunging?
Yeah.
I am. I hate it and I love it all at the same time.
What do you have?
I actually do cryotherapy.
Oh, gotcha.
So there's a cold plunge at my gym that I'll use. They've got saunas and cold plunges after, that, but I don't typically use the one at the gym too much because cold plunges, people tend to think that you go do a cold plunge as soon as you're done with your workout and it helps with recovery. The reality is doing a cold plunge right after a workout actually hurts muscle fiber rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
You're better doing a cold plunge the day after you worked out or 2 days after you worked out. That's actually a better time to do a cold plunge. But yes, extreme cold and extreme heat are both excellent for your body. And I will say that in modern day society here, we're so used to indoor temperature control that our body is just not exposed to extreme heat and extreme cold the way that it was always designed to be. And we actually are losing some of that evolutionary response to the environment because we've got everything so controlled nowadays that people barely even spend time in the sun because, they walk outside to get in the car and drive to the office and then go indoors at the office. Like, few people really spend time outside. Few people actually sweat much. Like, for God's sake, I go to the gym and I listen to people complain that it's hot in the gym and they want to turn the air conditioning up. Like, you're literally here to sweat. But they want to turn the air conditioning up because it's hot at the gym. And it's like, guys, like we've gone too far.
Yeah. Yeah. And then people are wondering why their systems aren't working like they should be. Because we're
Correct.
just avoiding discomfort at all costs.
100% of the time. I mean, that's who we are, right? We're always trying to avoid that. We eat because something, I always laugh and say, when I ask you a question about dining, I don't ask you what nutrition you need today or what nutrition that you haven't had yet. What do? I ask you what sounds good. Like we eat based on what our taste buds tell us. We don't actually eat based off what's nutritious. Like what sounds good today? Well, why do my ears have anything to do with what I choose to eat today? And because that's how we eat. We don't eat based on what we need. We eat based on what we enjoy.
Yeah. Which I think so much of our taste buds have just been hijacked by people in labs who are making these hyper palatable foods.
Problem. That's a processed food issue, but yes, totally agreed. Totally agreed.
But yeah, I mean, people don't realize, like, if they're craving ice cream, for example, like they think they're craving ice cream, but they're actually craving like something more nutritious than that ice cream is actually giving them, but they don't realize it because they don't get that on a normal basis.
Yeah, because so much of what's in this stuff is so synthesized.
Yeah.
Tell anybody if they're interested in going and getting a Zona. If they want to go check it out, just go to zona.com. There's a lot more information, obviously, on our website than what we can share over the course here. We did actually set up a coupon code. So if anybody wants to purchase a Zona because they listen to your podcast, the code they set up for you in advance was Cold Plunge 100. So if someone uses the coupon code Cold Plunge 100, they actually save $100 off the price of the product. So if they want to go pick up a Zona, they're absolutely welcome to. And I would encourage it. If they have questions, reach out to our customer service team. Reach out to anybody. Send us a text, send us an SMS, send us an email, give us a call, whatever you got. They'll gladly walk you through how to use that. But again, the coupon code Cold Plunge 100 is live. Anybody's welcome to use that and save $100 off the purchase of their Zona.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
You bet. Appreciate you, Michael.
This is the Cold Plunge Podcast with me, Mike Gorman. Be sure to check out the video version of this podcast on our YouTube channel and check the show notes for any references, studies, or links to anything I spoke about on our website at plungereviews.com/podcast.